Alright, so today I will be doing my presentation on democratic citizenship and Canadian public policy. So, what is participatory democracy? Participatory democracy is democracy in which citizen participation is at the forefront of the democratic movement, and it's what allows for democracy to flourish. This applies to all three layers of Canadian government, whether it be municipal, provincial, and federal. Now, in looking at it through a public policy context, policy is what leads to civic engagement, and civic engagement is what leads to policy. And so what we're seeing here is a continuous cycle within the framework of participatory democracy, where citizenship regimes rely on policy as well as civic engagement in a continuous self-fulfilling flow in order to function properly. So, what are citizenship regimes? Citizenship regimes are institutional norms and systems that define access to these individual regimes by particular individuals. So, how are citizenship regimes formed? First, institutions are a result of historical construct or the product of political action. Institutions, therefore, are a byproduct of historical and societal construct. Second point is that politics matter in the context of the formation of civil society and social relations. Politics help form citizenship regimes and determine how we as a society function. And now the third point, citizenship as a political idea has a history based upon the creation of the national state. Citizenship, in theory, is based upon the notion that the concept itself of citizenship belongs to the nation state. Citizenship relies on the concept of the nation state or the national state in order to assert itself. And so, looking within this context at Indigenous rights within constraints of citizenship, within the current construct, citizenship regimes force Indigenous peoples within a construct that does not allow their society and culture to flourish. Because of this, citizenship within the state of Canada means that automatically they are oppressed by the state itself, because by being a part of the state, they're not given the right to self-identify, they're not given the right to an identity which is unique from the citizenship regime and the citizenship state. Therefore, Indigenous decolonization and identity are constrained and cannot function within the current regime. If we look at it through a historical context within Canadian history from 1867 to the present day, Indigenous people were not permissible participants in citizenship regimes. They were a part of the state, but they were not allowed to assert themselves within the state. And because of this, what we had was a context where technically they were a part of the system, but they were not given the right to participate in this system in a way that it would serve their own societal and cultural benefits. Instead, the citizenship regimes, up until this point in time, had been used by the settler colonial state in order to assert itself against indigenous sovereignty. So, what is the future of indigenous rights in citizenship regimes? Action must come through reconciliation. Reconciliation, in this context, would lead to accountability and responsibility. Now, one of the fault lines within the reading, and one of the fault lines found within academia discussion on this topic at large, is that reconciliation can have multiple differing definitions. Is it dialogue? Is it land acknowledgements? Is it monetary compensation? Is it direct changes to public policy? Is it perhaps giving back ancestral land to indigenous peoples? And so it's hard within this context to define what is truly reconciliation and how can we move forward with reconciliation that is able to satisfy the wants and needs of all indigenous people throughout Canada. Citizenship regimes in a Canadian context could focus upon the embracing of a Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, while giving sovereignty to these peoples. So, within, as was previously discussed, there is no concrete definition of how we as Canadians can achieve reconciliation. However, an interesting first step would be to embrace and put into law, therefore apply to public policy, the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, so that Indigenous peoples in Canada have legal standing within the Canadian judicial system and have a platform that they could advocate from a legal standpoint. With that being said, however, sovereignty cannot be achieved within the confines of citizenship regime because a citizenship regime expects all members of a citizenship to unite and to discuss together as one, where political discourse is encouraged. However, there are still confines within the societal and cultural aspects of the citizenship regime. This could lead to this leads again to the issue of reconciliation and how do we achieve it as a nation? Is the only way to achieve sovereignty? Is the only way to achieve sovereignty to separate oneself from a citizenship regime? And within a Canadian federal context, how do we achieve this sovereignty? This later leads us to racial discrimination in citizenship regimes. The framework for current public policy in Canada was made in the period after the Second World War. So, 1940s, this was made at a time long before the 1960s, 1970s, 1980s, 1990s, and into the modern day, before wars in these decades brought hundreds of thousands of migrants into the country and changed the societal dynamic within our provinces, within our municipalities. And so what led to these waves of migrants after the post-war period was multiculturalism. And from the notion of multiculturalism is universalism. Unfortunately, universalism of Canadian liberalism leads to the dissolution of inclusivity for the purpose of societal assimilation. The idea that within a citizenship regime, everyone must collaborate as one. Everyone must be able to be one. And because of that, it prohibits, while under the guise of multiculturalism, it prohibits the self-expression of communities. It prohibits the self-expression of marginalized peoples who are represented within multiculturalism, however, aren't able to speak up for themselves in their favor. So, racial inequality within the context of economics. There's three interesting points that were brought forward in the reading. The first is the welfare state. Racialized Canadians who have to use social assistance are faced with diminishing support from governments. As with every decade that passes, the cost of living increases. And while we're mirroring this change, what we're also seeing is governments that are trying to rein in their spending. We're trying to rein in their provincial and federal budgets. And because of that, social welfare and social assistance is not able to satisfy a minimum comfort of living as it might have been, let's say, 20, 30 years ago. And because many racialized Canadians rely on these supports, well, as they continue and as support becomes less and less, what we're seeing is that they're continuing to struggle to adapt to the current Canadian economy. And another interesting point that was brought in the reading that I really liked is that when there is a political debate regarding individual wealth, it's very much along the lines of individual wealth. For example, does an individual earn $40,000 a year or less? Do they earn, I don't know, $75,000 a year or more? That's the debate that the context of the debates that surround financial stability in Canada. Unfortunately, the debate has never addressed racialized wealth. And it has never addressed the unfortunate notion that there are many racialized communities that are generally don't hold as much wealth as some of the settler colonial communities in Canada. And ultimately, this argument is a bit flawed because individual, the wealth of each individual is certainly important within the discussion of talking about wealth inequality in Canada. And it's, at the same time, it's not necessarily productive neither to group wealth based on racialized communities, because you are including outliers within a community in a very generalized picture. So immigration, also what we're seeing is many individuals who immigrate to Canada who have some form of education are not able to transfer their credentials into the Canadian labor market. The reading, a few examples that were given are if the name on a racialized individual's resume is shown not to have a name of an individual who is quote unquote of Western origin, then they are more likely to be racially discriminated against due to their name. Their credentials based on their country of origin, they might be frowned upon. And it's also important to note that certain forms of employment are reserved for particular groups of Canadian citizenship status. So this might make sense, for example, within the federal or provincial public services. However, we also see different job opportunities within the Canadian economy that are not open to refugees. Some might not be open for Canadians with a permanent residency. And so what it does is, while there's a certain encouragement of immigration into Canada, once these racialized communities arrive into the country, they're not given the chance to participate to their fullest potential within the Canadian labor market. And so, similar to a point that I raised in the last slide regarding multiculturalism, again, usually focuses on cultural recognition. But within that discussion, there is very little mention of economic inequality between racialized communities. Multiculturalism can also be seen as a disguise against systemic racism within the state. Promoting multiculturalism, while the federal and public service also has as a whole a disparaging view of racialized communities, whether it's groups that deal directly with the public, such as Immigration, Refugees and Citizenship Canada, the Canada Border Services Agency, right? All different levels or departments of a public service that deal with racialized communities on a regular basis, and therefore commit various acts of systemic racism at different levels in their communications with these members of racialized communities. So, my concluding remarks. In theory, citizenship regimes are a system of continuous feedback. But unfortunately, it is very hard and oftentimes does not allow for alterations nor reforms to these regimes. And so a possible solution might be sovereignty. Sovereignty becomes the solution to the plight of indigenous and racialized peoples in citizenship regimes. It gives them the right to assert themselves, not within the citizenship regimes, but separate, non-equal footing to these regimes. And like in many situations, really, many different political situations, it's very hard to reform citizenship regimes when those who benefit from the system do not want any alterations to what provides to them their benefits. And so these were the discussion questions that I had for students with the expectation that we were going to present live in front of the class. My first question: can democracy and public policy survive with lower levels of engagement from citizens within the population? Based on the notion that I promoted in the first slide, that participatory democracy, you need public policy to lead to civic engagement, and civic engagement leads back to public policy. Would lower participation in the political process, would it ruin that cycle? The second question: can citizenship regimes fix themselves? This is fairly self-evident, and it's what I had discussed in earlier slides regarding indigenous and racialized communities. And can separation from citizenship regimes be a net positive for those involved? And I think that's an open question. I would have really much liked to have a debate on the topic. And to be quite frank with you, I think there's many ways to answer this question. I think there can be clear benefits of asserting oneself upon the global stage by way of separation from a citizenship regime. However, it's like all things in politics, it's a very complicated process, and it's not separation often has to be achieved by way of unconventional means. There you go. Thank you.